G'day and welcome back to Critical AFL on YouTube for today's episode of WAFL Watch, where a quietly decimated WAFL Eagles went down to East Perth in the mud at Sullivan Logistics Oval. For today's episode, I'll be covering a brief overview of the loss, who the best players were, including our best AFL listed talent, promising performances, and then our best WAFL listed players, and then my key takeaways from the match, before finally my predictions for who is pushing for a spot in the AFL side next week. So, just like the last two reviews, today was the third WAFL round in a row, just getting drenched in the mud for the WAFL Eagles. It's not even like it's been raining every day of the last month, but between that bye, which I think was the only dry week we had over that period when West Coast weren't actually playing, they've somehow landed the wettest day of every given week to play in. Anyway, it did have that same unavoidable impact, which was causing another scrappy game of footy, and the field at Sullivan Logistics Oval looked like the horse track at Gloucester Park across the middle, after being churned up for what must be weeks now of WAFL footy. I mentioned we were quietly decimated in the WAFL. There were just 10 AFL listed players out there, but when you look at all the inclusions to the AFL side earlier in the day, we pretty much drew on the last of our midfielders in the twos as well. So that left us especially vulnerable across that part of the ground. The team contested really impressively for the first half, or most of it anyway. Basically, the entire side was just riding off Matt Flynn's brilliance. But there was a string of goals eventually that started late in the second quarter that allowed the Royals to get away from us. And they just kept the run on going from there. In the end, it was a blowout that was very similar to the AFL game. And that last quarter was when the real heavy rain arrived as well. So it kind of just felt like clock watching, I hate to admit, at that point. With the team so low on AFL players, the number of really good performances was a lot smaller as well, but there were some that could definitely impact selection next week. So I'll get into those. Like I mentioned, our standout best was Matt Flynn, who surprisingly didn't win the most ruck taps, but I think he was a lot more effective with the taps that he did win. And he also led the WAFL Eagles for disposals impressively, finishing with 24, along with imposing himself constantly all day just on the contest. I even thought his one percenters were probably the best in our side. Just little things like following up his handballs with Shepherds for his teammates, which was also pretty amusing to see our 203 centimetre ruckman following up his handballs by bulldozing his way through the little East Perth midfielders while they were trying to give chase. But after Flynn was the clear standout, like I said, Jaden Hunt did a lot of the heavy lifting and provided run for us all day. I even saw him manage a clean bounce on the only green patch of grass coming off the back pocket. I think that was before it started really bucketing down, though. And I think senior guys like Hunt, they're desperately needed out there in the WAFL at the moment. He does a good job of just taking an extra second during all the chaos before he picks off a good target, which sometimes is all it takes. And it wasn't easy to do on a day like that day. Our next best is from the WAFL listed players, and I normally do set aside a little designated segment of these reviews to talk about them, but Shannon Lacasson was easily good enough to be in our best players for his 50th game with the WAFL Eagles, so I didn't want to undermine his impact by waiting for that segment to mention him. I've said it before in these videos, he does pretty much everything we need from him, sometimes floating to different parts of the ground to make room for AFL listed players. That's when our injury list is smaller, so there's not as much space, say, up forward where he normally plays. And today he did a heap of the heavy lifting through the midfield, not just getting his own possession, but applying that really same high quality of defensive pressure that I sometimes mention about Elijah Hewitt in the AFL. It's that ability to really run with the guy before he picks up the ball and afterwards that I think is a really strong attribute that we need at West Coast at the moment. And he showed that, so really impressed with him. And to round out my best players is Luca Grego. He's kind of the prototype for playing in the wet weather games in the WAFL, just using his physicality to bulldoze a path through the middle of the ground, which is amazing, remembering that he's, I think, 19 or maybe just 20 now. And a lot of the time he managed to get his own handball back from those long chains of plays that he created. So that was really good to see from him. Our list of strong performers didn't run too deep, like I've mentioned, but it's worth giving a mention to Jack Hutchinson, who was also in our best early, but it looked like he came off at some point in the third quarter, and I didn't see him again after that, and I was checking the stats to see if he was racking them up somewhere quietly, but he wasn't, so hopefully he's not injured. Malachi Champion also showed his usual class out there, and I definitely think we'll see a lot more AFL footy from him next year after a pre-season, just building that tank of his. For my observations of promising performances, there was another debutant this week from our pool of potential draft-linked talent to the club. So his name's Tyler Williams. He showed a lot of class as he worked his way into the match. He kicked a goal, showed his pace, and he's a part of our next generation academy. So he should be able to join the club through our rookie list, a bit like Malachi Champion did last year, as long as we don't have to match a bid on him at the national draft. But other than that, pretty much all of our young players, our young stars in the AFL side were in the AFL or already made the best list today. So unfortunately, there was no sign of Charlie Banfield, who I mentioned last week. That young draft prospect debuted for us then and wasn't here today, so I'm not sure what the go is there. And that just takes us to our WAFL listed players. So like I mentioned, Shannon Lacasson was definitely the best from the WAFL players, but there were also good performances from Thomas Edwards-Baldwin, Caleb Datson again this week. Josh Burke up forward, he's quite a handy key forward target for us, and Jack Eastoff down back. Which brings me to my key takeaways. It wasn't easy to make anything particularly meaningful from my key takeaways today, but that was just really between the lack of AFL listed players and the constant wet weather games. So the big thing that stood out to me was the difference that an established ruck makes at the WAFL level. And I'm not saying the WAFL isn't the place to develop the other rucks that we've got and we're working on, but just to follow on from my early trade and draft preview video that I put out earlier in the week, I think the entire club will benefit if we can manage to lure Darcy Cameron across from Collingwood during the off-season. I think there's, if that does happen, going to be some scope for us to make a few difficult decisions with the fringe rucks that we're still trying to, or have been trying to develop in the WAFL. And if we bring both Darcy Cameron in through trade and Cooper Duff Tyler in through the draft, which I think is a good chance of happening, we'll probably end up with the same amount of rucks on our list, even after dropping maybe a couple of the fringe rucks at the end of the year. So without needing to hold any more spots for rucks by bringing those guys in, I think it would be a pretty good net gain, and we'd have at that point Bailey Williams and Matt Flynn to either support Darcy Cameron and have one of them in the WAFL at any given time, which makes a huge difference. Anyway, that's me with my trade and draft hat on already at this point in the year, which is probably a little bit earlier. So before I get carried away, I'm going to round out my review by getting to my predictions for the AFL squad next week. While there wasn't a heap of depth in the WAFL this week, I do think Matt Flynn is our most likely to push his way straight back into the side after being dropped, just on the back of the performance that he had. Also, Jaden Hunt could also get the call up, especially with the little indicators like Tyrell Dewar getting subbed off against Melbourne. Sometimes those are the hints that you need to figure who's really, on the fringe at selection on Thursday. And then I also wouldn't be surprised if Luca Grego gets an opportunity at some point over the next couple of weeks. It could go either way, since it looks like we are choosing to play the young guys late in the season just based on the Melbourne selection. But that said, it could also flip the other way if the selection committee sees it as maybe too much of a liability after the Melbourne belting. I will be keen to see what happens with the team selection for Adelaide when it comes out this Thursday. Like I said, that could go either way. And that covers just about everything for today's episode of WAFL Watch. Unfortunately, I do have a disappointing announcement to make, and that is that this will be the last episode of WAFL Watch series for the year from me. We'll be in Bali next week for a wedding, and that'll be a couple of weeks that we'll take over there. So Not only is the coverage of WAFL on 7 Plus only streamed live, which makes it difficult when you're flying in the air or something like that, but it also isn't available in countries outside of Australia anyway. So I don't think there's going to be any chance for me to watch those WAFL Eagles games and then provide these reviews on them afterwards. So I hope everyone has enjoyed this coverage, not just today, but all year. And for the record, I do have every intention of keeping these reviews going next year. So if you're still watching and you're not already a subscriber, please consider hitting that subscribe button to catch all of these, as well as the AFL reviews and the off-season content that I'll be putting out for the rest of 2025. Otherwise, I'll hopefully see you all again next week for our game against the live ladder leading Crows. I think they might have just been pipped in the end, but it's going to be a very tough ask coming up against them. So hopefully I do see you then, and cheers until then.